Welcome back. In this session, we're going to create the external table to read the data from a gold layer and then copy that data into our internal table using the C task statement. So let's get started. The first thing we want to do is to start our dedicated SQL pool because at the moment it is paused. So let me resume that. And while that's happening, let me go over to our data hub and go to linked. And under there we've got our container, which is the NYC taxi data, and let's go over to gold, and this is the data that we want to create the external table on. So we want to create an external table which erase the data from the trip data. Green AGG, so if we go into the folders, the data is partitioned, as you remember, and the data is in the format of Parquet, and it's compressed using this snappy compression. So that's all the information we need instead of creating the script from scratch ourselves. This time let's use the UI to create the external table for us. So I've just clicked on the folder name and then let's click on Create External Table. 4,000 characters for the string columns is okay for us. I don't think we've even got any string columns. So let's click Continue, and now we need to select the SQL pool that we are going to create the table in. So I've selected the Dedicated SQL Pool, and that selects the database for us, which is NYC Taxi DWH. And now we need to specify the name of the table. So if I just give a table and then create the table in the DBO schema, I don't want that. I'm going to give the table name of the prefixes to specify that it's external, and it'll be trip data green ag that we don't have the schema called staging. That's okay. We'll create this schema when we are in the script. So I'm not going to create the table automatically. I'm going to use the SQL script to do that. So let's create the SQL script and then we can work on the SQL script. So let me click Open Script, and that's generated the code that we need. You will be familiar with all of these things from the serverless SQL pool sessions. So the first thing is to create the external file format, and it's clear in one called Synapse Parquet format. We can change the name of the format here and make it whatever standard we want to follow. So I'm just going to call it a Parquet file format, and we will apply that in other places as well. So I'm going to just simply replace this one, and that will be used in the table as well. So I'm going to simply change that as well. So it's going to create the Parquet file format with the format type as Parquet. And now we need to create the data source because data source is required for the external table. So we've got a data source name here. Again, I'm going to make it a bit more consistent. So I'm going to go for NYC taxi data _SRC. And I'll replace this in other places as well. So it's used here. So we create in the external data source here, and the location is the container within our storage account, which is the NYC taxi data in our Learn Synapse step-by-step DL storage account. So let me quickly replace the data source name here because we've changed that one, and then I'll walk it through the external table. So as you can see, it's quite simple. It's identified all the column names and the data types looks okay. So we got the integers and big int and float. It's only 4 columns we've got in our files, and we've got the location which is under the container. NYC taxi data and gold is the folder within that. And then we've got the folder trip data green AGG, that's where we got all our data. So the one thing you may notice is that we don't have to specify /** as we do in the serverless SQL pool. We just have to give it a folder and go and find all the files within the folder. That's the only difference between the serverless SQL pool and this one in terms of creating the external table. So let me copy the schema name because it didn't put the schema name here. So I'm going to simply put the schema name here. So now it'll create this table for us. So the only thing we've got left to do is to create the schema because we don't have the schema called staging. So let's put that as the first statement. And now we've got everything we needed to do. So what we're doing is we are creating the schema staging vehicle in the external file format and the data source and the table. And we are doing select top 100 from the table itself. So let's execute this against our database in our dedicated SQL pool called NYC Taxi DWH. So let me run this script. As you can see here, we've got the external table created and the data has been selected as well. Now that the table is created, we will be able to see that in our data hub under workspace. And if I click open the SQL database and let's do a refresh, we should be able to see another database here, which is the NYC Taxi DWH. And if I expand that, I'll have the external tables. One difference you will notice here is that you will have tables as well. So if I expand the LDW, which is on the Serverless SQL Pool, we didn't have the tables because Serverless SQL Pool doesn't have the concept of tables, but within the Dedicated SQL Pool you can have physical tables as well. We haven't created any tables yet, so we won't be seeing anything. But if I expand the external tables, I'll see the external table that we created. So now the next step for us is to create a physical table within our database and copy the data from the external table into the physical table. There are a few options we've got there, so we can create the table and then use the insert statement to do that. But the most simplest thing to do is to use the C task statement. So that will create the table as well as insert that data for us. So let's do that. Let me go to the bottom of my script and start writing. So the syntax for the C task format is very similar to the RDMS. There are a couple of things which are specific for Synapse, which will be like distribution and things like that. So let me show you that in the help. So we have got the documentation here for the create table, a statement, and there are a couple of examples as well at the bottom. So let me go over to the top. So that's what you've got there. So you can specify the distribution option and you can specify the select statement. And as you can see, we got the distribution as hash round robin replicate, and also you can specify the storage format as well. So you can do clustered columns to index or heap, and you can specify partitions and things like that. So let's keep it simple and let's just do a C task. I'm going to copy one of the statements from here and then make the change press. So let's start making the changes. So we want to create the table in our dedicated SQL pool. So let's call this one as DWH. So we need to create a schema called DWH. We'll do that in a minute as well. And we want to create the table as trip data green egg. So it'll be called with the same name. So it's DWH trip data green egg. And we can leave these as defaults. So clustered column store index is the default dedicated SQL pool. So it'll be stored in the column store format, and distribution we can go for the round robin distribution. We only got a few records here, and let's just distribute randomly. And here you can specify select. So you can have a select statement in the clause, or you can only select a few columns, and it's totally up to you. But I'm going to do a select star, so it'll be taking all the data from our source table, which is the external table, and create this table in our database. So I'm going to change the name of the table here to replace with our table name. And as we said, we want to create the schema. So again, I'm going to do create schema DWH. So they are the two statements we want to run. So let me just quickly run those statements. And that should create the table for us. So let me just run them. So the table is now created. So if I go over to the database here and expand on the tables, and let me click refresh because we've just created the table, we should be able to see that table here, and we can see the columns, and we can right click to get a select statement as well. I'm going to just run a select statement here itself in the same script so we can save all of that together. So let me just do a select from this table, that is the internal table. So that's what you need to remember. So this table exists in our database. So as you can see, we've got the data back. So with this, we've successfully created an internal table in our data warehouse, which is the dedicated SQL pool, by copying the data from our Azure Data Lake. So what you need to remember is that we've taken the data from Data Lake, and when we did the read, we used Polybase to create it. So all of that read happens in parallel using the MPP capabilities, and that data now got copied into our internal table. But the internal table has got a distribution set to round robin. So all of that data has been distributed to all the 60 distributions that we talked about. So when we read the data, we are going to have better performance from this data. And let me quickly go to the top and take you through all of this one more time. So we created the schema that we needed for staging, and we created the external file format, external data source. And using those two information, we created the external table. But this external table is sat on the Azure Data Lake. So whenever we query from this table, we are querying the data directly from the data lake, but via using Polybase to read the data. So that means the data is going to be using the power of the MPP architecture and using that information. We've selected the data and we've created a table within our internal storage in the Dedicated SQL Pool. When we did that, we created it with the column store index cluster column store index, as well as the distribution of round robin. And we just selected the data here. Because the data is going to be stored across 60 different distributions, and we can have up to 60 compute engines to parallel process all of this data. So that's everything I wanted to talk it through in this session, but before we finish it, let's save the script. So I'm going to create a new folder under the NYC taxi folder here, and I'm going to call this 1DWH, and let's give a meaningful name for this script. And let me click on Publish All to store this script in our Synapse repository. And that's the end of this session. I'll see you in the next one.